Madrid, 1834. The palace corridors were silent, yet they seemed to tremble with whispers. Behind closed doors, the king was dead, but the story of his body was only beginning. As the royal physician, you had been summoned not to heal, but to preserve. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, stood before you, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights. Her voice quivered as she gave the order. The late Ferdinand VII must be preserved, not entirely, but in a manner so strange, so grotesque, that you momentarily questioned your own sanity. You approached the bed where the king's body lay. Even in death, Ferdinand seemed to mock those around him, his face slack yet twisted with the echoes of cruelty that had defined his reign. But it was not the expression that unsettled you most. It was what lay beneath the embroidered silk sheets, the infamous secret that courtiers had whispered about, but never dared record officially. A monstrosity of flesh, grotesquely oversized, oddly misshapen, a symbol of both shame and twisted pride. The very organ that had tormented his wives, consumed his thoughts, and, in its own way, warped the destiny of a kingdom. Your trembling hands prepared the tools of preservation. You were not just handling lifeless tissue. You were sealing away the physical emblem of a reign deformed in both body and spirit. Spain, in the wake of Ferdinand's death, was like the king himself. Disfigured by paranoia, scarred by cruelty, and left gasping for continuity. To preserve this monstrous relic was to preserve a warning for history itself. As you worked, your mind drifted back to the tales whispered in palace corridors. Stories of screams muffled by thick velvet curtains. Stories of custom-made cushions, oils, and restraints devised not for pleasure, but for survival. Stories of desperate physicians trying to engineer intimacy as if it were a medical experiment. And behind it all, a man haunted by the contradiction of his own flesh, cursed by its deformity, yet clinging to it as proof of virility. This was not merely the preservation of a corpse. It was a grotesque ritual, one that revealed the distorted soul of Ferdinand's Spain. His organ, oversized and useless, mirrored his monarchy, grand in outward form, destructive in practice, and incapable of producing life where life was most needed. It had crushed the women who bore the duty of queenship, just as his rule had crushed his people. The weight of history pressed in around you. Spain had been brought low, not only by war and rebellion, but by the private shame of a single man turned into public disaster. His court was not a seat of governance, but a theater of paranoia where mockery was punished with exile, and intimacy became indistinguishable from violence. And now, in the still chamber where the dead king lay, you were made the keeper of the most terrible secret of all. But to understand how Ferdinand VII came to this end, how a king could be undone not only by politics and rebellion, but by his own anatomy, you must look back. Back to a childhood shaped by corruption, back to a dynasty poisoned by inbreeding, back to a youth where whispers about his deformity grew louder than prayers for his future. Before the silence of this room, there had been screams. Before the stillness of death, there had been humiliation, cruelty, and desperation. And before Ferdinand became the most despised monarch of his age, he'd been a boy cursed at birth, not by sorcery, but by blood. To understand Ferdinand VII, one must begin at the very roots of his bloodline, a tangled tree of branches bent back upon themselves, where cousins wed cousins and uncles married nieces, where the thirst for dynastic purity birthed not strength but frailty. Spain's Bourbons and their Habsburg ancestors had long treated marriage not as love, but as strategy, a tool to stitch alliances across Europe. Yet, with each generation, the circle tightened, until the royal nursery became less a cradle of princes and more a laboratory of inherited decay. On October 14, 1784, within the solemn walls of El Escorial Palace, Ferdinand came into the world. His parents, King Charles IV and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, were themselves first cousins, children of a long tradition of incestuous unions that left behind a legacy of madness, infertility, and deformity. The Spanish court, outwardly resplendent with the rituals of Catholic monarchy, was inwardly poisoned, its future king already marked by the sins of genetic repetition. Ferdinand's childhood was a portrait of dysfunction. His father, Charles IV, was a man better suited to a hunting lodge than a throne, timid, indecisive, and more concerned with game birds than governance. His mother, Maria Luisa, by contrast, burned with appetites. She openly pursued her affair with Manuel de Godoy, a guard-turned-favorite who rose to be Spain's de facto ruler. Godoy's presence at court was constant, and young Ferdinand grew up watching his mother humiliate his father daily with her brazen devotion to another man. From this tableau of weakness, betrayal, and power traded like coin, the boy absorbed lessons that would shape him. Trust is folly, loyalty is a trap, and power must be seized at any cost. But it was not palace scandal alone that marked Ferdinand's early years. As he grew from child to adolescent, it became apparent that nature itself had played a cruel joke. His anatomy began to develop in ways that bewildered court physicians. By his teenage years, the whispers had already begun, whispers that darted through kitchens, servant halls, and diplomatic channels, carried with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. For in a time when the male form was judged by classical ideals of proportion and harmony, Ferdinand's body revealed something utterly alien. He was cursed with a member that defied both beauty and function. Grotesquely oversized, distorted in shape, a monstrosity of flesh that would dominate his life as surely as any crown. It was both the source of secret ridicule and the foundation of his deepest insecurities. Imagine the suffocating atmosphere of a royal court, where every glance might conceal a smirk, every bow might hide laughter. Servants stifled giggles, courtiers made sly remarks, and foreign envoys carried tales back to their masters about the Spanish embarrassment. Ferdinand learned early that his body was a spectacle, that he himself was the punchline of an unspoken joke. The humiliation was corrosive, seeping into his character, twisting it until cruelty became armor and suspicion his closest ally. Even as a boy, he began to lash out. His tutors noted his vindictive streak, punishing those who erred in even the smallest ways. The household servants bore the brunt of his outbursts, dismissed, flogged, or exiled for imagined offenses. Once, when a page accidentally entered his chamber as he was changing clothes, Ferdinand's fury was boundless. The boy was flogged, his family cast out of Madrid. The message was clear. No one could witness his shame and survive unscathed. Spain had birthed kings with weak minds, with twisted jaws, with failing bodies. But now it had produced a boy whose very essence, his inheritance, his manhood, was warped into both weapon and wound. Ferdinand was the living embodiment of dynastic decline, heir to centuries of incest, heir to a legacy of humiliation, heir to a curse that was not supernatural but genetic, yet no less devastating. This was the prince who would one day be hailed as El Deseado, the desired one, by conspirators who dreamed of his reign as salvation. Yet, in the quiet of his youth, Ferdinand already knew the truth. He was not desired. He was mocked, feared, whispered about. And from that knowledge grew a resentment that would one day consume not just his wives or his court, but an entire kingdom. By the time Ferdinand entered adolescence, his physicians could no longer dismiss what they saw as a passing peculiarity. What grew upon the boy was not merely unusual, it was unprecedented. In the vaults of the Vatican, sealed for centuries, lie secret reports penned by trembling hands of royal doctors who dared to describe in clinical detail what could never be spoken aloud at court. One physician, cautious in tone, wrote, "His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of extraordinary dimensions and a most peculiar form, such that intimate relations may prove challenging." Another was less restrained. "The prince's organ resembles a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at its base, yet swelling to the girth of a man's fist at its extremity, and long enough to serve as a walking stick." This grotesque contrast of shapes was not only a physical burden, but a psychological one. In an age when masculine beauty was measured by proportion and restraint, when ancient statues of Greece were held as the model of refinement, Ferdinand's deformity marked him as a freak of nature. What, in modern times, might have been mistaken for excess virility was, in his own age, a source of ridicule and disgust. He was a prince whose manhood, instead of guaranteeing power, threatened to strip him of dignity. The palace became a nest of whispers. Servants carried gossip like smuggled treasure, snickering in kitchens and sculleries. Courtiers crafted veiled jokes in Latin or Italian, trading them like poisoned coins. Even foreign diplomats recorded the royal anomaly in coded letters sent across Europe, adding to the humiliating reputation that trailed Spain's crown prince. Ferdinand's paranoia, though extreme, was not without foundation. People were laughing. He saw mockery in the respectful bows of his subjects, in the carefully measured words of tutors, even in the empty politeness of brides-to-be paraded before him. His shame grew barbed, and those barbs turned outward as cruelty. A chaplain's memoir records a chilling incident. A young page once entered the prince's chamber at the wrong moment. He glimpsed what he should not have seen. Ferdinand, instead of forgiving the accident, ordered the boy flogged and his family exiled. To witness his shame was to pay in blood. That boy's scream, echoing through palace corridors, was a forewarning of the terror Spain itself would one day endure. But humiliation alone cannot explain the darkness that took root. Ferdinand's condition was both curse and obsession. His nights were spent in secret experiments, studying himself as though his own flesh were an enemy to be conquered. He tested ointments, powders, strange instruments brought by foreign physicians who promised relief. Each failure deepened his hatred, not just of his body, but of the world that mocked him. Here lay the genesis of a tyrant, a prince whose most intimate self was a grotesque parody of power, whose every glance reminded him of laughter behind closed doors, and whose answer to ridicule was the exercise of cruelty. Ferdinand was no longer simply the victim of a genetic accident. He was becoming something else, a man who would wield shame as a weapon, suspicion as armor, and power as the salve for a wound that would never heal. As Ferdinand passed from adolescence into manhood, the whispers did not fade. They multiplied. What had once been a private deformity was becoming the unspoken question of Europe. Could the heir of Spain ever fulfill his most sacred duty to produce an heir of his own? Ferdinand, desperate to prove himself, turned increasingly toward quackery, superstition, and the dark marketplace of false hope. Court alchemists and wandering physicians were smuggled into Madrid under cover of night. Each claimed to possess the secret to his torment. Each dangled the promise of normality. Ferdinand drank potions ground from rhinoceros horn, pearls crushed into powder, exotic herbs carried from the Orient. He consumed elixirs spiced with mercury, swallowed tinctures of opium and camphor, and endured painful procedures meant to balance the humors. Nothing worked. Yet he persisted, a willing victim for every charlatan bold enough to exploit his despair. One foreign physician, writing privately to a colleague, described the atmosphere of the royal court as a carnival of quacks. There were men who promised to shrink the monstrous organ through surgery, others who claimed they could stretch the body into proportion through traction devices more suited to torture chambers. Ferdinand submitted to them all. His desperation was a market, and Madrid was filled with merchants eager to profit. The irony was cruel. In a kingdom bleeding from wars abroad and corruption at home, its prince squandered fortunes on potions and instruments designed to tame his body. Gold that might have armed soldiers or fed peasants was instead spent on powdered bones and magical amulets. The private tragedy of one man's anatomy became the public ruin of a nation. And yet, beneath the absurdity, there was a haunting truth. Ferdinand was not merely seeking a cure for himself, he was chasing the salvation of his dynasty. In a monarchy where lineage was everything, failure in the marriage bed was failure as a king. Every useless potion, every absurd contraption was an attempt to escape the destiny written in his blood. That the Bourbon line, poisoned by centuries of incest, was collapsing through him. He grew suspicious of his own doctors, accusing them of hiding remedies or mocking his plight in secret. Servants, tasked with preparing the potions, lived in fear, for if Ferdinand suspected their failure was deliberate, punishment was swift and brutal. Some were beaten, others vanished entirely. The palace, already heavy with whispers, now vibrated with terror. Ferdinand's obsession was no longer confined to medicine. He began consulting astrologers who charted the stars to determine auspicious nights for conception. He summoned mystics who declared his deformity a divine sign, a rod of heavenly favor misinterpreted by mortal eyes. At times he believed them, seeing himself as chosen. At other times he cursed God himself for cruelty. His faith, like his body, became twisted by contradiction, half superstition, half despair. It was in this fevered atmosphere of obsession that Ferdinand approached his first marriage. Not with the tender hope of a young groom, but with the desperation of a man clutching at remedies like a drowning man clutching at driftwood. He would wed not for love, nor even for alliance, but for proof, for the chance, however remote, to overcome the monstrous fate that nature had dealt him. The story of his bride would soon reveal how deeply this obsession would scar not only Ferdinand, but the women condemned to share his bed. In 1702, Ferdinand was 19 years old when he was married to his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. The match had been arranged when both were still teenagers, and the young princess had crossed the Mediterranean with romantic illusions in her heart. She had heard her husband-to-be called El Deseado, the desired one, by his supporters. To her, it conjured the image of a noble prince, perhaps stern, perhaps shy, but dignified and strong. The wedding itself seemed to confirm those dreams. Madrid erupted with celebration. The cathedral thundered with organ music, courtiers paraded in gowns sewn with jewels, and streets overflowed with cheering subjects who saw in the union a promise of stability. Maria Antonia, bright-eyed and hopeful, entered the palace believing she was about to live out a fairy tale. But royal ceremonies end, and wedding nights begin. Behind the gilded doors of the bridal chamber, the princess's illusions shattered in an instant. Ferdinand's valet arrived with strange instructions. The ladies-in-waiting were told to prepare the room with custom arrangements. Into the chamber came cushions unlike any bed had known, bottles of oil, strange wooden contraptions wrapped in velvet. Maria Antonia, sheltered in her education, could make no sense of them. She had been raised on prayers, music, and etiquette, not on knowledge of the body. To her, these objects seemed ominous, even threatening. When Ferdinand himself entered, the horror reached its climax. As he disrobed, the truth of his condition stood revealed, and Maria Antonia's reaction was recorded in hushed, scandalized whispers for generations. She screamed as if confronted by the devil himself, backing against the wall, crying, "Monstro! Monstro!" until her attendants feared for her sanity. What followed was not a wedding night, but a medical ordeal. Physicians, already stationed nearby, were called into the chamber to explain the procedures required. Cushions were arranged, oils applied, and the act itself was carried out with an efficiency that resembled surgery more than intimacy. Maria Antonia, trembling and nearly catatonic, was dosed with laudanum to endure what her body and mind could not otherwise tolerate. From that night onward, her marriage became a cycle of dread. Whenever Ferdinand desired an attempt at consummation, the same ritual unfolded. Servants preparing devices, physicians on hand to supervise, the queen drugged into submission. What should have been the most private union between husband and wife was instead a grotesque performance staged in secrecy, a medical experiment disguised as royal duty. The psychological toll was immense. Ferdinand, already insecure and suspicious, interpreted his bride's terror not as the natural reaction of a traumatized young woman, but as a personal insult. He brooded over her screams, convinced they revealed a deliberate rejection of his manhood. Maria Antonia, meanwhile, sank deeper into despair. She leaned more heavily on laudanum until she could scarcely endure the sight of her husband without it. And yet, the weight of dynastic expectation pressed on both. An heir must be produced, no matter the cost. Ferdinand's physicians whispered of new methods. Artisans crafted ever more elaborate contraptions to make the process survivable. Each attempt ended in tears, in blood, in failure. Thus began Ferdinand's reign as husband, a reign of terror played out not in the halls of government, but in the royal bedchamber. And just as his deformity warped his private life, it would soon distort his entire kingdom. The palace walls held many secrets, but none darker than the routine of Ferdinand's marriage. What should have been the intimacy of husband and wife had become a nightmarish ritual, part medical procedure, part act of cruelty. Every attempt to conceive an heir followed the same grim choreography. The specially crafted cushions were brought out, oils and tinctures applied, the queen drugged with laudanum to dull her horror. Physicians hovered nearby, their faces stiff with professional detachment, while servants lingered outside the chamber doors, straining not to hear the muffled sobs that inevitably followed. For Maria Antonia, these encounters were nothing short of torment. Each left her weaker, more dependent on the laudanum that dulled her senses. Her attendants began to notice how she would beg for the opiate long before the king summoned her, as if only its haze could keep away the dread of what awaited her. Slowly, she transformed from a vibrant young princess into a pale, haunted figure, her spirit eroded by trauma. And yet, against all odds, she conceived. Twice the palace dared to hope. Twice bells rang out in cautious joy. But hope, like everything in Ferdinand's world, was poisoned. The first pregnancy ended in miscarriage by the 4th month. Courtiers whispered what the physicians would not, that the brutal strain of those unnatural marital ordeals had damaged her body beyond endurance. The second time seemed more promising. Maria Antonia carried the child nearly to term, but the birth was a blood-soaked catastrophe. After hours of agony, the baby was lost, and the queen herself barely clung to life. She recovered, but not fully. Her body was ravaged, and her mind carried the scar of grief too heavy for one so young. For Ferdinand, the tragedies did not stir compassion. Instead, they deepened his paranoia. He began to accuse Maria Antonia of conspiring against him, of deliberately sabotaging their chances of producing an heir. He whispered that she moved in ways meant to provoke miscarriage, or that she secretly harbored liberal sympathies which made her unworthy to continue the Bourbon line. His suspicions hardened into cruelty, and his cruelty into open hostility. The young queen, only 21, descended into a state that today would be recognized as profound psychological trauma. She prayed endlessly, begging forgiveness for sins she could not name, convinced she was cursed. Her dependence on laudanum grew so severe that she drifted through the palace like a ghost, caught between waking and oblivion. When she died in May of 1807, the official cause was politely given as fever and her delicate constitution. But behind closed doors, the whispers were darker. Some said she had succumbed to years of laudanum abuse. Others murmured that Ferdinand himself, tired of her failures, had hastened her end with poison. The sudden death of the palace apothecary only days later, his final letter seized by royal agents and never seen again, did little to quiet such rumors. Publicly, Ferdinand draped himself in mourning, his eyes red with rehearsed tears. Privately, however, he seemed relieved. Almost immediately, he turned his attention to the prospect of a new wife, one, he hoped, who might endure where Maria Antonia had failed. But the truth was inescapable. It was not Maria Antonia who had failed Spain. It was Ferdinand himself. His body was a prison, and his paranoia a poison. His first wife had been its first casualty. The kingdom, though it did not yet realize it, would soon follow. Maria Antonia's death in 1807 marked a turning point in Ferdinand's life. To the public, he appeared the grieving widower, but behind closed doors, his relief was palpable. He had rid himself of a wife who, in his mind, had betrayed her duty. What little affection he was capable of had long been devoured by suspicion and paranoia. Now, he looked to the future with cold calculation. A new marriage, a new attempt, another woman upon whom he could project both his hopes and his rage. But Ferdinand's deformity was not the only shadow twisting his character. By this time, his paranoia had hardened into a worldview. He had come to see mockery everywhere, in the polite nod of a courtier, in the hollow compliments of his tutors, even in the eyes of passing servants. To him, Spain itself seemed to be laughing at him, and for every imagined insult, there had to be punishment. Stories circulated of servants who vanished after accidentally glimpsing the prince undressed. Guards who gossiped about the royal condition found themselves posted to the most dangerous frontiers of Spain's crumbling empire. Even tutors who corrected his lessons too firmly discovered their careers abruptly ended. Ferdinand was learning the art of cruelty, and the palace became his training ground. It was in this climate of fear that he attracted a following. Spain, weary of his father, Charles IV's weakness, and disgusted by the unchecked power of Manuel de Godoy, the Queen's notorious favorite, saw in Ferdinand a potential savior. These nobles and officers who would come to be called Fernandinos projected onto him their hopes for reform. They spread propaganda that he was intelligent, patriotic, and destined to restore Spain's greatness. The irony was bitter. They had chosen as their champion a man whose private life was collapsing under the weight of dysfunction. Yet Ferdinand knew how to play the role. He adopted the title El Deseado, the desired one, with a sly smile, letting others see in him what they wished. Meanwhile, in secret, his darker nature festered. He kept mental lists of those he believed had mocked him, rehearsed fantasies of vengeance, and tested the limits of his power through acts of cruelty disguised as discipline. By 1807, Ferdinand was entangled in a conspiracy to overthrow his own father and unseat Godoy. The so-called El Escorial conspiracy revealed the duplicity at the heart of his character. For when the plot was exposed, Ferdinand did not stand firm beside his allies. Instead, he betrayed them all, confessing in humiliating detail, naming names, and begging his parents for forgiveness. His fellow conspirators paid with exile and disgrace, while Ferdinand slithered back into favor, his cowardice disguised as contrition. This pattern, using others for his ambition, then discarding them when convenient, would become the hallmark of his reign. Already, the seeds of tyranny were sown. Already, Spain's future king was showing the traits that would one day make him not the desired one, but the despised one. And even as he played at politics and betrayal, The deformity that haunted him continued its grotesque evolution. Physicians noted that his anatomy seemed to change with age, growing even more monstrous, more impossible. His condition had become not just a private shame, but a looming question over the future of the dynasty. If he could not sire an heir, all Spain's suffering might be for nothing. Soon, events beyond his control would rip the mask from his face. In 1708, Napoleon Bonaparte himself would stride into Spain, and Ferdinand would be forced to confront not just the humiliation of his body, but the humiliation of his crown. The year 1808 plunged Spain into chaos. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of Europe, turned his gaze toward the Iberian Peninsula. The Bourbons, crippled by weakness and scandal, offered little resistance. Charles IV abdicated, Godoy fell from grace, and in the confusion, Ferdinand briefly ascended the throne, only to be stripped of it almost immediately. Spain's so-called Deseado became Napoleon's prisoner, a king without a kingdom. He was sent to Valenciennes, a chateau in France. To the Spanish people, this captivity became a rallying cry. Peasants, soldiers, priests, men and women of every station rose in revolt, fighting a brutal guerrilla war against French occupation. The countryside bled for the restoration of their king. They imagined him as a patriot, enduring captivity with stoic dignity, longing only to return and free his people. But the reality inside Valenciennes was far more grotesque. While Spain burned, Ferdinand was consumed not with the fate of his kingdom, but with the same obsession that had haunted him since adolescence. French intelligence had studied the Spanish royals extensively, and Napoleon's physicians quickly learned of the prisoner's infamous condition. They treated him not with reverence, but with clinical curiosity. Here, freed from the Spanish court's suffocating etiquette, French doctors examined Ferdinand with scientific zeal. They measured, sketched, and recorded in detail the monstrosity that Spain had whispered about in shame. Their reports, buried in Napoleonic archives for decades, described an organ so misshapen it seemed almost mythological. Some speculated he suffered from a rare endocrine disorder, others from a freakish mutation of nature. Whatever the cause, their verdict was unanimous. Ferdinand's anatomy was an obstacle no alchemist or charlatan could cure. He submitted to their experiments because he had no choice. Some were brutal, bordering on torture, attempts to reshape, compress, or correct what nature had made. The French were fascinated, but Ferdinand was humiliated. A king reduced to a specimen, his most private shame catalogued in foreign ledgers. Yet, even in captivity, his obsessions did not relent. He wrote endless letters, not about Spain's suffering, but about brides. He begged European courts for potential matches, describing himself as misunderstood, insisting that his condition could be managed. These letters, written in his own hand, reveal a man grotesquely detached from reality. While villages in Spain were massacred in his name, he was sketching out plans for a second wedding night. It is one of history's cruel ironies. While brave Spaniards fought and died to restore their king, Ferdinand's only battles were against the shape of his own flesh. His people imagined a martyr in chains. In truth, their king was a prisoner of his own body long before Napoleon ever took him captive. After 6 years, in 1814, Napoleon's empire began to crumble. The French retreated from Spain, and the desired one returned in triumph. His carriage rolled through Madrid as crowds wept and hurled flowers. Children born during the war saw their first glimpse of the monarch for whom their parents had sacrificed everything. Spain, battered but hopeful, believed it had regained its savior. Ferdinand smiled and waved, basking in their adoration. But even as the streets thundered with joy, his mind was elsewhere. He was not thinking of rebuilding his nation, nor of rewarding those who had fought for his return. His thoughts were fixed, as always, on the same impossible question: how to conquer the grotesque curse of his body, and how to bend a woman to it. The Savior had returned, but Spain was about to discover it had welcomed home not a king of hope, but a tyrant of shadows. The year 1814 should have been Spain's rebirth. Napoleon's armies had been driven out, and the people who had bled for their homeland filled the streets with hymns of triumph. To them, Ferdinand VII was no longer merely El Deseado. He was the symbol of survival itself, the living embodiment of Spain's resistance. They knelt in the dust as his carriage rolled by, throwing flowers, shouting prayers, weeping with joy. For a moment, the kingdom believed its suffering had meaning. But Ferdinand returned not as the liberator they imagined. He returned with the cold eyes of a man who had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. The The first decrees of his restored reign revealed his true nature. The Constitution of 1812, the hard-won promise of liberty drafted during his captivity, was torn apart and cast into the fire. Absolutism was restored. Censorship, purges, and inquisitions followed. Spain had dreamed of rebirth, but awoke to find itself chained once more to the whims of a paranoid tyrant. And yet, even amidst this political violence, Ferdinand's gaze never strayed far from his private obsession. His first order as restored king was not to rebuild Spain, but to rebuild his arsenal of marital devices. Craftsmen were summoned from across Europe, artisans of velvet, steel, and leather who could construct ever more elaborate contraptions to accommodate the king's grotesque anatomy. In hidden chambers of the palace, carpenters and blacksmiths bent their craft not to war or governance, but to the monstrous requirements of the royal bed. Once again, a bride was sought. This time, the choice was Maria Isabel of Portugal, his cousin, barely 19 years old. To the outside world, the match was presented as a union of Bourbon and Braganza bloodlines, a symbol of Iberian unity after years of division. To Ferdinand, it was yet another chance, another woman's body upon which to test whether fate could be defied. The wedding, held in 1816, was staged with all the splendor that monarchy could command. Gold cloth draped the altars, incense curled toward vaulted ceilings, and Madrid streets echoed with processions of nobles. But beneath the grandeur, courtiers whispered nervously. They knew the fate of Maria Antonia. They had heard her screams echo through the palace walls, and some wondered if Spain was about to repeat the same tragedy with a new face. Maria Isabel, young and naive, entered her marriage unaware of the horrors awaiting her. She had been warned only in the vaguest of terms by her attendants, reassured that special arrangements were customary among kings. On her wedding day, she smiled shyly at her new husband, believing she had stepped into the storybook life promised to princesses. But when the doors of the royal chamber closed behind her, innocence met monstrosity. The velvet cushions, the oils, the strange contraptions were once again assembled. And for the second time in Ferdinand's life, a bride's screams would pierce the palace night, not cries of passion, but of terror and pain. The crowd outside rejoiced in fireworks, bells, and music. Inside, a young queen began her descent into a private hell. The wedding night of Ferdinand and Maria Isabel of Portugal was not a union, but an ordeal. Servants standing guard outside the chamber later swore they heard the kind of screams that chilled the blood, screams not of modesty or shyness, but of genuine terror. When dawn came, the sheets were stained with blood, the chamber left in disarray as if some violence had taken place. The young queen had never recovered from the shock of that night. Courtiers soon noticed the change. She flinched at sudden sounds, stammered when spoken to, and grew pale whenever her husband entered a room. Her ladies-in-waiting whispered of sleepless nights, of nightmares in which she cried out against the monster. What should have been the sanctuary of marriage had instead become a chamber of trauma. Ferdinand, rather than recognizing his wife's suffering, interpreted her fear as insult. In his warped mind, her trembling was not the natural response of a violated young woman, but evidence of treasonous disdain. He began to suspect that Maria Isabel conspired with others to mock him. Soon, her correspondence was intercepted. Her food tasted for poison. Her chamber searched for evidence of betrayal. What had begun as a private dysfunction metastasized into political paranoia. Every whisper in the palace seemed to Ferdinand a coded insult, every glance a conspiracy. He demanded ever greater secrecy about his condition, punishing servants for even imagined indiscretions. The royal household lived in terror of his sudden rages, and still the duty of producing an heir hung over them. Physicians were summoned once more, not to heal, but to contrive methods of coupling without disaster. Cushions were adjusted, devices re-engineered, dosages of laudanum increased for the queen. What was meant to be the most intimate act between husband and wife became instead a grotesque performance staged for the survival of a dynasty. Maria Isabel's mind began to unravel. At times she lapsed into hysterical fits, sobbing uncontrollably. At others she became eerily calm, staring into nothing, her face pale and waxen like a living ghost. Some nights she screamed in her sleep, calling out warnings as though pursued by a nightmare she could never escape. Yet, in Ferdinand's eyes, her suffering was not cause for pity, but another insult to his dignity. He grew harsher, his suspicion of betrayal spilling beyond his wife to infect the entire court. He saw enemies in every shadow, traitors in every gesture. His paranoia would soon stretch far beyond the royal chamber, reshaping the very politics of his reign. But within those palace walls, Maria Isabel remained the first victim. Her marriage, like that of her predecessor, was not a bond, but a sentence, a slow disintegration of body and spirit beneath the weight of one man's deformity and one kingdom's desperate silence. What unfolded in the years after Maria Isabel's wedding night was less a marriage than a series of grotesque experiments. The royal bedchamber became a laboratory where doctors, artisans, and attendants conspired in silence to transform the act of conception into something mechanical, almost theatrical. Physicians were summoned at odd hours to measure, to advise, to prescribe. Anatomists offered diagrams and calculations, suggesting angles and contraptions more suited to engineering than intimacy. Devices of velvet and iron were tested, then discarded. New cushions were designed, thicker, firmer, more elaborate. Everything was tried, nothing succeeded. Ferdinand, desperate for a solution, widened the circle of witnesses. Foreign physicians were invited, Germans with precise instruments, Frenchmen with speculative theories, even itinerant specialists whose claims bordered on circus trickery. It is said that on more than one occasion, these men were allowed to observe the royal couple's attempts at consummation, recording every failure with clinical detachment. Thus, the bedroom of the Spanish king became a stage for voyeuristic science, where the queen's dignity was stripped as thoroughly as her body. For Maria Isabel, the humiliation was unbearable. Her health declined swiftly. She grew gaunt, her cheeks hollow, her voice trembling. Courtiers noted that she seemed to drift in and out of reality, her eyes often fixed on some invisible terror. What her doctors called hysterical episodes were, in truth, the breaking of a spirit under relentless assault. The cruelest irony came in the form of phantom pregnancies. On more than one occasion, Maria Isabel displayed the symptoms of conception, her abdomen swelling, her body shifting as though life were growing within. For weeks, the court rejoiced, Ferdinand pacing the halls with a nervous pride. But always, inevitably, the truth emerged. There was no child. Her body had been deceived, her mind tricked into conjuring hope from despair. Each phantom pregnancy ended in humiliation, feeding Ferdinand's suspicion and deepening the queen's collapse. By 1818, Maria Isabel was a shadow of the radiant girl who had arrived from Portugal. Her body wasted, her mind frayed, she succumbed at last to what the physicians gently called nervous exhaustion. Rumors whispered of self-harm, of a young woman so desperate for escape that she hastened her own end. Ferdinand's reaction revealed the twisted contours of his soul. He did not mourn as a husband might. Instead, he raged that his enemies had stolen from him a chance at an heir. He ordered multiple autopsies, searching for signs of poison. He accused her ladies-in-waiting of conspiracy, had several arrested, and interrogated them under threat. In his grief, there was no tenderness, only suspicion. At her funeral, Ferdinand's behavior horrified even his most loyal supporters. He demanded to see the corpse repeatedly, touching her lifeless form, muttering about the wasted potential of her womb. He commissioned a death mask, which he kept in his chambers, speaking to it as if it might answer. To him, Maria Isabel was not a woman lost, but a failed vessel, an empty chalice in the endless, cursed ritual of his reign. But Spain, restless and wounded, could not wait for a king to mourn. The empire was collapsing, colonies slipping away in rebellion, the treasury drained. And Ferdinand, whose personal tragedies had already consumed 2 queens, was preparing to seek a third. By 1819, Ferdinand was once again a widower, twice over, his first 2 wives carried off by despair and exhaustion within the suffocating walls of his court. Yet Spain still demanded an heir, and the search for a third bride began almost immediately. Diplomats worked quietly, for Europe had begun to whisper about the horrors that awaited any woman who became Queen of Spain. Princesses declined discreetly, their families citing delicate health, religious obligations, or sudden changes in political calculation. Few dared admit the truth aloud. No dynasty wished to sacrifice a daughter to Ferdinand's monstrous condition. At last, one family consented. The House of Saxony, weighed down by debts and desperate for Spanish favor. Their daughter, Maria Josefa Amalia, 24 years old, was offered as Ferdinand's third bride. Unlike her predecessors, Maria Josefa was neither naive nor wholly innocent of what awaited her. Her physicians had been briefed. Her attendants had whispered warnings. She knew, at least in outline, the nightmare that marriage to Ferdinand entailed. And so she arrived in Madrid with a determination not to be broken by fear, but to endure with methodical composure. The wedding was subdued compared to Ferdinand's earlier nuptials. The Spanish court had grown weary of matrimonial spectacles followed by funerals. The ceremony was dignified but restrained, more duty than celebration. Maria Josepha herself seemed calm, almost clinical, as though she had steeled her mind for what must come. Her approach to marriage was unlike the romantic hope of Maria Antonia or the terror-stricken innocence of Maria Isabel. Maria Josepha treated the union as a problem to be solved, a medical condition to be managed. She carried with her instruments and remedies from Saxony, and even a personal physician skilled in delicate marital circumstances. With him, she devised a schedule of carefully timed encounters, each meticulously prepared with oils, cushions, and drafts. She kept records, dates, durations, symptoms, outcomes, like a scientist conducting an experiment. But no amount of preparation could change the reality of Ferdinand's body. The grotesque shape, the impossible proportions, the violent strain of each encounter remained insurmountable. Attempts at consummation left her bruised, bleeding, and increasingly frail. Still, she persisted, documenting each effort with a detached precision that unsettled those around her. For Ferdinand, her composure was unbearable. He did not see resilience, he saw mockery. He suspected that Maria Josepha was treating him not as a husband, but as a specimen. Her notes, her calm demeanor, her reliance on physicians, all of it fed his paranoia. He convinced himself that she was secretly reporting his shame to Saxony, that her family intended to expose him to Europe as a failure, a curiosity unfit to rule. Thus, what began as Maria Josepha's attempt at survival became another stage for Ferdinand's cruelty. He watched her correspondence obsessively, had her letters intercepted, interrogated her attendants. He grew harsher in his demands, pressing her into encounters beyond what her health could bear, as though punishing her for daring to endure with dignity what had destroyed the others. Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, Spain was unraveling. One by one, the colonies of the New World were breaking free. Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, all declaring independence. Gold and silver, the lifeblood of the empire, slipped away. Spain starved while its king obsessed over potions and positions, over whether his wife recorded too much in her medical journals. Cabinet meetings were postponed so that physicians might consult on marital progress. Ministers waited while Ferdinand brooded over phantom conspiracies in his own bedchamber. Maria Josepha bore it with quiet endurance, but her health faltered. She grew pale, her body frail, yet she clung to her regimen of notes and records as though order could hold back despair. And then, in 1829, after a decade of failure, the impossible seemed to happen. She was with child. For the first time in years, hope flickered through the halls of Madrid. Bells rang, prayers were offered, and Ferdinand dared believe his curse had been broken. But hope in his court was always a cruel trick, and what followed would prove more devastating than any failure that had come before. As Maria Josepha struggled through her uneasy marriage, Spain itself was breaking apart. While the king obsessed over medical charts and marital contraptions, the empire his ancestors had built was bleeding away in the Americas. From Mexico to Argentina, colonies rose in rebellion. Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, and other liberators marched beneath banners that spoke of freedom, while Spanish forces, exhausted and underfunded, faltered. Between 1810 and 1825, one territory after another slipped from Spain's grasp. What had once been the richest empire in the world, its wealth drawn from silver mines, sugar plantations, and vast trade networks, was dissolving like sand through an open hand. But Ferdinand hardly seemed to notice. While dispatches arrived reporting defeats, surrenders, and declarations of independence, his court remained consumed by the private theater of his bedchamber. Ministers were made to wait hours, sometimes days, for audiences, while the king secluded himself with physicians. When they did meet him, he often ranted not about strategy or war, but about his suspicions that Maria Josepha mocked him in her private notes. In the streets, the people began to murmur. They had once called him El Deseado, the desired one, but now they called him El Rey Felón, the Felon King. Bread grew scarce, taxes rose, bandits prowled the countryside, and yet the king spent his treasury on quack doctors, exotic elixirs, and craftsmen who built strange contraptions in the bowels of the palace. Spain's decline had a symbol, a king whose most intimate failures mirrored the collapse of his empire. Foreign ambassadors observed the absurdity with thinly veiled contempt. One Austrian envoy wrote, The Spanish monarch spends his hours in consultation with alchemists and surgeons, while the New World is lost piece by piece. His court is a theater of paranoia, and his ministers actors waiting for a cue that never comes. Maria Josefa endured her role with clinical patience, but she was not untouched by the despair. She knew she had married into a crumbling dynasty. In her letters home, intercepted by Ferdinand but preserved in fragments by Saxon archives, she confessed to feeling like a nurse to a patient rather than a wife to a king. She did her duty with mechanical diligence, but the weight of her husband's suspicion and Spain's decline pressed on her spirit. The irony grew sharper with each lost colony. Across the Atlantic, revolutionaries painted Ferdinand as a tyrant whose impotence symbolized Spain's decay. Pamphlets circulated with caricatures of the king, a bloated figure clutching at his loins while the globe slipped from his hands. To rebels, he was not merely an incompetent ruler, but living proof that Spain's monarchy was cursed, its bloodline spent, its crown hollow. And still, Ferdinand clung to his obsession. He scoured his wife's journals, interrogated her attendants, and demanded daily updates from his physicians. His fixation on producing an heir was no longer just personal. It had become political theater, a desperate attempt to prove that the Bourbon line could still continue. Then, against all expectation, the impossible happened. Maria Josefa's body, frail and worn from years of strain, showed signs of life stirring within. She was pregnant. For Ferdinand, it was a miracle. For Spain, it was a final chance. Bells would ring once more, but this time with a hope that carried the weight of an empire's survival. When Maria Josefa's pregnancy was confirmed in 1829, Madrid erupted with a joy that felt almost foreign after so many years of despair. Church bells rang, cannon fire thundered from the ramparts, and the streets swelled with processions of priests, nobles, and commoners alike. For the first time in decades, the Spanish court believed the curse might be broken. An heir, at last, an heir, seemed within reach. For Ferdinand, the news was more than political salvation. It was personal vindication. He strutted through the palace, his paranoia momentarily eclipsed by euphoria. Physicians were ordered to attend the queen day and night, astrologers were consulted to chart favorable omens, and priests blessed the royal chambers until the air was thick with incense. Ferdinand himself became a man obsessed with guarding the fragile spark of life inside his wife. He placed guards at her doors, commanded food tasters for every meal, and ordered that her steps be counted so she might not overexert herself. Yet beneath this frenzy of care lay fear. He was haunted by the ghosts of Maria Antonia's miscarriages and Isabel's phantom pregnancies. He knew too well that hope, in his palace, was a cruel trickster. And so he smothered Maria Josefa with attention so suffocating it resembled imprisonment. The queen endured it quietly, her Saxon discipline carrying her through endless examinations and whispered prayers. But her health, already fragile, grew weaker as the months passed. Modern historians believe she suffered from complications of the placenta, a condition dangerous even with the best of care. In Ferdinand's court, where medicine was tangled with mysticism, her chances dwindled. In May 1829, the worst came to pass. Labor began too early, violent and bloody. Courtiers fled the chamber, their faces ashen. Physicians worked frantically, while Ferdinand, wild-eyed, insisted on witnessing the ordeal. He barked orders at the doctors, clutched relics to his chest, demanded prayers one moment and shouted curses the next. After hours of agony, a child was born, a girl. For a few fleeting hours, Spain rejoiced, but the infant's tiny breaths faltered, and before the day was done, she was gone. Maria Josefa survived the delivery, but only barely. She lay pale and trembling, her body racked with fever. Ferdinand, refusing to accept defeat, ordered the doctors to continue their efforts as though the child might yet be revived. For days he raged against God, against his enemies, against fate itself. He even demanded that the infant's body be kept in the palace, as if sheer will could summon life back into her cold flesh. 3 weeks later, Maria Josefa followed her daughter into the grave. The physicians named childbed fever, but those who tended her whispered of something darker, despair so profound it drained the will to live. The double loss shattered the palace. For Ferdinand, it was a descent into madness. He refused burial at first, forcing attendants to preserve the bodies longer than decency allowed. The air grew thick with decay, yet still he lingered over his wife's lifeless form, muttering of betrayal, of divine punishment, of enemies unseen. When, at last, the coffins were sealed, Ferdinand collapsed into a depression that bordered on death itself. He stopped eating, refused audiences, and sat for hours in silence before the death masks of his wives, as if communing with the ghosts of those he had destroyed. Spain, meanwhile, drifted rudderless, its king a hollow shell, its empire crumbling, its people starving. Yet fate was not finished with Ferdinand. Even as grief consumed him, his advisers pressed him toward yet another marriage. Spain could not survive without an heir, they insisted, and so, astonishingly, within months of burying his third wife, Ferdinand began preparations for a fourth. But this time, destiny would play its cruelest trick yet. By late 1829, Ferdinand was 45 years old, ravaged by illness, paranoia, and grief, yet still desperate for an heir. His counselors, terrified of a dynastic crisis, urged him toward a fourth marriage. After much negotiation, a bride was found. Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily, barely 23 years old. But Maria Cristina did not come to Madrid as a blank slate of hope. She arrived already carrying a secret, one swelling visibly beneath her gown. She was pregnant. The child could not possibly be Ferdinand's, yet the king, blind with desperation, embraced the deception. To him it was divine providence at last, a gift from heaven sent by unconventional means. The wedding was a hurried, almost farcical affair. Courtiers whispered openly of the queen's rounded belly, yet no one dared voice the truth aloud. Spain needed an heir, and Ferdinand, perhaps for the first time, seemed willing to swallow humiliation if it meant the continuation of his line. In 1830, the queen gave birth to a daughter, Isabella. For Spain, it was a moment of fragile relief. At last, there was a successor, however questionable her legitimacy. For Ferdinand, however, the birth was a torment of contradictions. He adored the child, gazing for hours into her face as though searching for fragments of his own likeness. Yet he also knew, deep in the secret recesses of his mind, that she was not his blood. The heir who saved his dynasty was also proof of his ultimate failure. The marriage between Ferdinand and Maria Cristina quickly decayed into the same grotesque pattern that had consumed his earlier unions. He insisted on continuing attempts to father another child, one truly his own. The chamber once again filled with cushions, oils, and devices, with physicians summoned to oversee doomed efforts. Maria Cristina, pragmatic and shrewd, submitted outwardly but endured in silence, biding her time. Unlike his earlier wives, she possessed a resilience born of political instinct. She knew survival meant endurance, not collapse. But Ferdinand's paranoia had by now metastasized beyond the bedchamber. He launched midnight inspections of the queen's apartments, bursting in with guards to catch her in imagined treacheries. He had spy holes carved into walls through which he watched her every movement, while she prayed, while she ate, even while she nursed their daughter. He saw plots in her letters, treason in her silences, betrayal in her calm composure. Maria Cristina endured this suffocating surveillance with remarkable cunning. She presented a serene public face, embodying the image of the dutiful queen, even as her private letters to her Neapolitan family revealed despair. "I live in a glass cage," she wrote, "every breath measured, every glance observed." For Ferdinand, the marriage was a theater of suspicion, the child a mirror of his shame, and the queen both a wife and a prisoner. Yet the irony could not be missed. In accepting Isabella as his heir, Ferdinand had at last secured the very continuity he had sought for decades. His bloodline had failed, but his dynasty survived, at least for now. Still, the king could not let go of his obsession. He demanded more children, more proof, more impossible victories against his own body, and in his desperation, he dragged not only Maria Cristina, but all of Spain deeper into the labyrinth of his paranoia. By the early 1830s, the Spanish court had ceased to resemble a center of governance. It had become, instead, a labyrinth of whispers, spies, and midnight terrors, all emanating from Ferdinand's diseased mind. The king, consumed by suspicion, saw conspiracies in every gesture, treason in every silence. He rotated his guards daily, convinced that long service would corrupt their loyalty. Ministers were summoned to chambers where Ferdinand would deliberately contradict himself, then watch their faces to test whether they dared correct him. Those who faltered were marked as traitors. Those who spoke too boldly fared no better. No one was safe. The palace itself was remade into a fortress of paranoia. Secret passages were constructed so the king could move unseen, mirrors positioned at angles to catch eavesdroppers, spy holes drilled into the walls of Maria Christina's chambers. Servants found themselves forced into double roles, carrying food to the queen, then reporting on the way she ate it, assisting her with letters, then copying down her expressions as she wrote. Maria Christina, though shrewd, could not escape the suffocating net. She became the central object of Ferdinand's obsession. He suspected her of infidelity, of treason, even of conspiring to poison him. Before every meal, tasters sampled the dishes, and Ferdinand insisted they wait half an hour to ensure no slow-acting toxins were at work. The rituals of dining stretched into hours. The entire court held hostage to the king's terror. Even religion was tainted by his suspicion. When Maria Christina increased her devotions, he wondered aloud if her prayers were coded messages to foreign Catholic powers. When she wept in the chapel, he accused her of performing grief as theater for hidden enemies. Foreign ambassadors sent reports back to their capitals describing a court in decay. The king has turned Madrid into a theater of shadows. One French envoy wrote, "Every man is a spy, every woman a suspect, and all speak in whispers for fear of the air itself." And in the midst of this suffocating atmosphere stood Isabella, the infant princess. To her father, she was both salvation and torment, an heir who secured his throne and a reminder of his own failure. He spent hours staring at her tiny features, commissioned an artist to paint her likeness at every stage. He compared these portraits with his own, searching for resemblance, scouring her face for proof she was his blood. The irony was unbearable. The child who preserved his dynasty was living evidence of his impotence. Maria Christina tried to shield her daughter from the worst of the madness, but the queen herself was breaking. Her letters to Naples reveal a woman unraveling. "I am never alone. Even in prayer I feel his eyes upon me. I dream of freedom, yet awake to the same cage." The court, once famed for its etiquette and refinement, had become a grotesque parody of monarchy, a nest of suspicion where loyalty was impossible and fear the only currency. Spain's empire was gone, its people starving, its throne occupied by a man devoured from within by shame and paranoia. And as Ferdinand's health faltered, the shadows only deepened. By 1832, Ferdinand's body had begun to fail as completely as his mind. Years of paranoia, sleepless nights, and self-inflicted torment left him trembling, bloated, and broken. Courtiers spoke of his hands shaking uncontrollably, of his voice slurring into rambling accusations during audiences. He could no longer hide the toll of decades spent fighting both his enemies and his own flesh. Illness was his constant companion. Gout gnawed at his joints, fevers racked his body, and digestive ailments left him pale and weak. Yet, in the midst of physical collapse, his suspicions only grew stronger. He became convinced Maria Christina was plotting to poison him through touch. Before allowing her near, he demanded that physicians examine her, probing her skin and breath for imagined toxins. What should have been tenderness between husband and wife became a grotesque parody of intimacy, performed beneath the cold gaze of doctors. The queen, enduring this humiliation with practiced composure, lived in a perpetual state of siege. Her letters from this time, smuggled to Naples, reveal the desperation of a woman who felt herself dissolving. "I walk through glass corridors," she wrote, "each step watched, each breath weighed. I cannot even hold my child without fearing his eyes behind the walls." Meanwhile, Ferdinand's court sank into absurdity. Ministers were subjected to loyalty tests so bizarre they seemed designed to end trap. He accused priests of carrying secret messages in their prayers, nobles of treachery in the color of their garments. Even birthdays and feast days became arenas of suspicion. Flowers arranged incorrectly might be a sign of conspiracy, a misplaced word proof of sedition. By the summer of 1833, the king's decline was unmistakable. He drifted in and out of delirium, sometimes mistaking courtiers for long-dead wives, sometimes demanding investigations into plots that existed only in his imagination. He muttered to the death masks that lined his chamber, conversing with them as though they could advise him better than his ministers. Spain, once the empire on which the sun never set, was now ruled by a man more ghost than king. When death finally came on September 29, 1833, it was almost anticlimactic. The official cause was given as gout, but his physicians knew better. He had been eaten alive by exhaustion, physical, psychological, and spiritual. His reign, deformed as his body, had ended in silence. But the story did not end with his last breath. As was customary, an autopsy was performed. In secrecy, physicians documented the truth that had shaped his life. The organ that had haunted Spain measured a grotesque 14 inches, its base unnaturally narrow, its tip grotesquely swollen. The internal tissues were scarred, riddled with evidence of crude, self-inflicted surgeries. For years, perhaps decades, Ferdinand had attempted to reshape himself with knives and instruments in secret, his body bearing witness to a lifetime of mutilation. The organ, preserved in spirit and sealed away, was sent to the Vatican archives. There it remains, too disturbing for public view, a relic not of virility but of shame. Scholars who have glimpsed the hidden records describe them with unease. Not a curiosity, but a monument to a reign of dysfunction. Spain, left to his daughter Isabella II, a child of questionable paternity, was fractured and weak on the edge of civil war. Ferdinand's death brought peace only to himself. His people inherited the chaos of his life, his dynasty the poison of his legacy. Ferdinand VII's death should have closed a chapter of humiliation, yet in many ways it was only the beginning. The grotesque relic sealed in the Vatican vaults was more than preserved flesh. It was the physical emblem of a reign twisted by shame, cruelty, and paranoia. Scholars who later glimpsed the secret records described them with unease, for they revealed not just a medical anomaly, but a psychological tragedy. A man mutilated by his own hand, carven at himself in a futile attempt to correct what fate had inscribed at birth. His wives had been the first casualties: Maria Antonia, Maria Isabel, and Maria Josefa, all destroyed by years of trauma, addiction, or despair. Maria Cristina survived, but only by becoming a prisoner in her own chambers, her every prayer and breath scrutinized. Their suffering was not confined to the palace. It radiated outward, poisoning Spain itself. The empire that Ferdinand inherited was already fragile, but under his reign it collapsed entirely. From Mexico to Argentina, colonies broke free, each new republic hammering another nail into the coffin of Spain's imperial grandeur. Within the peninsula, civil war loomed. The so-called Carlist Wars erupted almost immediately after his death, fueled by disputes over Isabella II's legitimacy. The child he had claimed as his heir, though not of his blood, was thrust onto a throne stained with suspicion. What, then, was Ferdinand's legacy? Not victories, not reforms, not prosperity. His legacy was failure. Failure made monumental by its intimacy. His reign proved how the private torment of a single man could metastasize into a national tragedy. A body warped by centuries of inbreeding became the vessel of a kingdom's ruin. His paranoia turned courtiers into spies. His cruelty turned queens into specters. His obsession with heirs left a country heirless to stability. Even in death, Ferdinand was mocked. Among the people, he was remembered less as El Deseado, the desired one, and more as El Rey Felón, the Felon King, the betrayer. Historians would later call him one of Spain's most disastrous monarchs, a man who presided over the empire's collapse while consumed by his own shame. And yet, there is a grim poetry to his story. His organ, preserved in silence, is not merely a grotesque curiosity. It is a monument to the dangers of power without restraint, to the cruelty born of humiliation, to the tragedy of a monarchy that allowed one man's deformity to deform a nation. Perhaps that is why his tale lingers, whispered with fascination and horror. For Ferdinand VII was not simply a tyrant. He was a cautionary tale, proof that the crown does not always magnify greatness. It can just as easily magnify deformity, turning private wounds into public disasters. The silk sheets that once hid his twisted body came to symbolize Spain itself, ornate on the surface, but beneath, broken, disfigured, and gasping for life. Ferdinand found peace only in death, but the kingdom he left behind would stagger for generations beneath the shadow of his curse. In the end, his name did not live on as he might have dreamed, sung in hymns or etched in marble. Instead, it survived in whispers, in scandal, in cautionary tales. His immortality came not from glory, but from grotesquerie. Ferdinand VII, the most perverse king of Spain, had become a relic of warning, proof that when shame sits on a throne, the whole nation pays the price.